The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar today, all about ComponentOne controls and .NET 5 support. As you may have heard last week at .NET Conf, Microsoft announced that .NET 5 is officially released and ready for production. So we're here and we're ready to talk about it. .NET 5 has a pretty big impact on the ComponentOne product offering, so we want to share our current plans so that you can be in the know and also give you an opportunity to share feedback and questions that you may have. I'm Greg Lutz. I'm the ComponentOne product manager. I've been working with .NET and specifically the ComponentOne products for over 13 years. If you recognize my name, it's probably because you may have seen me at a developer conference over the years, or perhaps one of the blogs I've written for Grape City. With me today, my colleague Alec is joining us, and he will monitor the chat. He's a member of our technical engagement team, helping customers every day solve technical issues and questions. And we'll stop along the way to answer some questions. So please go ahead and use the questions pane of GoToWebinar at any point. We'll also stop at the very end for final questions. The agenda for this webinar is to first cover some high-level highlights of .NET 5, but we won't go as much detail into this as Microsoft did at .NET Conf last week. But if you missed any of that content, we have you covered here today. But what we will go over in more detail is the full scope of .NET 5 support across the ComponentOne products as it is today. We'll look at which platforms are impacted, which controls are supported, and I'll share some demos. I can also share with you our roadmap for the next 12 months as it relates to .NET 5 development as we approach the next major versions of .NET in the future. And lastly, I'll show you how easy it is to get started using the .NET 5 controls, and we'll share some migration tips. So .NET 5 is the next evolution of .NET Core. It follows .NET Core 3.1. What Microsoft is doing is they're jumping from 3.1 to 5, and you'll understand why. Currently, there were 3 different flavors of .NET. We have the .NET Framework, we have .NET Core, and then we have the Xamarin and Mono stack. Plus, there's this thing called .NET Standard. So all of the .NET Framework all the frameworks are sort of built upon the .NET Standard runtime. It's like the lowest common denominator, essentially a portable class library that supports everything and is common among the 3 main frameworks. What Microsoft is doing is merging these all together, and this is .NET 5. It unifies .NET development across the web, cloud, mobile, and gaming by providing a single .NET runtime that could be used everywhere. So .NET 5 provides a single SDK and 1 BCL that can handle all current application models, including the desktop frameworks like WinForms and WPF. And since it includes about 50,000 .NET Framework APIs, that makes .NET 5 the next step forward for desktop development, especially apps built for WinForms and WPF. The last version of .NET Framework was 4.8. So by naming the next version of .NET Core 3.1 as .NET 5, it logically also follows as the next version of .NET Framework. Microsoft plans to release a new version of .NET every year, with every even number being considered LTS, which means long-term support. So .NET 6 released next year will be an LTS long-term support version. So even though .NET 5 is not LTS, this release of .NET is probably the most exciting thing that's happened in the .NET world for the past decade, especially for desktop development. So as a component vendor, Grape City, ComponentOne, we still see a lot of developers and enterprises working with WinForms and WPF, even though those platforms matured 10 plus years ago. So the way Microsoft looked at it, there really wasn't a lot that needed to be done over the past 10 years. And it wasn't so much that Microsoft was ignoring those platforms, it's just that they became stable and complete. So Microsoft was able to shift their focus on newer stuff like mobile and web. But we've been having to deal with these different flavors of .NET, all with slightly different APIs and runtimes. So .NET 5 helps sort of unify all of them. It also brings a lot of new capabilities to your desktop applications, aside from unifying the SDK with the other .NETs. So for example, single file application. This allows you to take your app and bundle it as one single file. And not only that, but you don't need .NET to be installed on the machine. .NET will be contained within the application. It can be copied to any Windows machine but that does not have .NET installed. Click Once, which was a popular way to publish desktop applications, is continued to be supported and also supports the single file application model. In addition to that, there's performance improvements for .NET 5. So for example, JSON serialization, it's become very common, and .NET 5 makes this about 20% faster. Socket performance improvement over .NET Core is about 30% faster. And .NET 5 is also about 3 times faster at serializing data, like collections and arrays, all with zero memory allocation, so your app will run even faster. It also provides smaller container images, which means .NET will run better in constrained environments. Plus, there's Windows ARM 64 support. And .NET 5 is not just for desktop development, but there are web and cloud improvements as well, which includes but not limited to better support for REST APIs, so for debugging and auto-generating client APIs. Blazor WebAssembly is now 20 to 30% faster, which we are really excited about. And you can also take an ASP.NET app and create an app that runs locally without .NET being installed, among other things for web and cloud development. Plus, for the developer, there are some C# improvements, such as records, which let you define a small and simple class all in one line, as well as top-level C# programs, which help you write less code by taking advantage of built-in system functionality. So what Microsoft wants to achieve here is a common native UI across all platforms. And those are some of the highlights about .NET 5. Of course, more information can be found by watching all of the .NET Conf sessions at the Microsoft website. But what I'd like to do next is go over the level of support across the ComponentOne products for .NET 5. And we'll show how to get started, cover migration tips, and our plans for the future. So last week, we also announced support for .NET 5, and we released some production-ready controls for some of our WinForms and WPF controls that are now built on .NET 5. We also support the use of .NET 4.5.2 controls within .NET 5 apps, with some caveats, which I'll get to in a little bit. And we support .NET 5 with our latest ASP.NET Core and Blazor controls. The web controls target .NET Core 3.1, and therefore they're supported in .NET 5. We've worked with Microsoft over the past year to ensure that these controls are all supported within the latest Visual Studio 2019, and we plan to stay aligned with all updates that Microsoft releases throughout 2021 and beyond. So let's focus a bit more on these desktop versions today, since they have the most change and the most impact. To give a big picture rundown of what our desktop control versioning looks like today, this is it right here. We currently provide for WinForms .NET 2.0, 4.0, 4.52, and 5.0 versions of the controls themselves. For WPF, we provide 4.0, 4.5.2, and 5.0 versions of the controls. Now, some of these versions are in maintenance mode as of 2020, which means we still ship updates with critical bug fixes, but they include no new features, no new controls, that sort of thing. And of course, you can always use older versions of controls in apps that target newer frameworks. So that means, for example, if your app is targeting .NET 4.7 or 4.8, you would use our 4.5.2, the version of our controls. So this is why you can also use the 4.5.2 controls in a .NET 5 app. So we've also worked over the past year to make sure that this scenario is supported. So you can use the latest .NET 4.5.2 controls in .NET 5 apps, but with some caveat that I mentioned. Even though .NET 5 carried over 50,000 .NET Framework APIs, there may still be some missing features. What we've done is we've been able to test all of our controls out of the box and make sure that they work out of the box. And in some of our samples and scenarios, we found that there were some issues related to OLADB and ODBC, some sort of system.data stuff. So a lot of that can be handled and worked around within your application. But we've tried to make sure that the controls out of the box do work in .NET 5 as well. So for some details on this, I also shared more details on this in my blog that I shared last week, and I'll share a link to that at the end of the session. But basically what we recommend is that if you're building a .NET 5 app, you should use our .NET 5 controls. And if you're building a .NET Core app, we recommend using the .NET 4.5.2 versions of ComponentOne. Now, the other important piece to all of this is knowing which controls are available in .NET 5 if you plan on migrating to .NET 5. So here's a full list of our WinForms and WPF libraries available today as a .NET 5 version. These controls are mostly production ready. Some of the WinForms ones are considered beta. And this is because part of the library is not fully supported. So for example, the command library is partially supported. We also have a few new controls. So over the past year, we released a new ribbon for WinForms, and that is now ported to .NET 5. In WPF, we also have a new ribbon. Now this one's completely new for .NET 5, and I'll show it in a bit in a demo. If you're familiar with our WPF controls, we previously had a toolbar and a simplified ribbon. So what we've done is we've merged them into a new ribbon library. The API is practically the same, but the namespace is new. Also, we have a new Flex Pivot library, which is in WPF, which is a refactored version of our old OLAP library, and it uses our new data engine and charting controls internally. And this version is a lot faster, as it can handle up to 1 million records in seconds. So if you were using our old OLAP controls, there's now a straightforward migration path to Flex Pivot for .NET 5. Our goal overall is to keep the API compatible with .NET 4 as much as possible. However, the namespaces might change in a few of these examples that I've mentioned. We also plan to add most of the controls that are not on this list by the end of 2021 based on your user feedback and some usage data that we collect. In a bit, I'll show you our roadmap. But before we do that, let's take a look at how to get started using these controls. The first thing you'll need to do is update your Visual Studio 2019 to version 16.8 or higher. This version now includes everything you need to build .NET 5 apps. You don't need to download any extra SDKs or tools separately. Then, to access the ComponentOne .NET 5 controls, you will want to get the latest versions running from Nuget.org. And we've even published a lot of our samples on GitHub under the Grape City account. Running the samples is probably the best way to fully learn how to work with the controls in an application. There's even a faster way, and that is our Demo Explorer. So we've recently updated this Demo Explorer, that's what you see on the screen there, to handle and support our .NET 5 demos. This application lets you run the samples without having to compile anything in Visual Studio, so you can essentially just demo the controls instantly, and a lot of them even show the code behind within the demo. When you're demoing our controls for the first time, I always recommend starting with the Control Explorer, which I'll show you this in a bit. I've provided the download link to this Demo Explorer in my blog post below at this bit.ly link, or you could just find it from the main demos page on grapecity.com. Now, before I move on to showing some demos, let's pause and see if there's any questions so far.
Yeah, so I've got a couple here. The first is, do ComponentOne WinForms controls support designer editors?
Yes, so regarding .NET Core and .NET 5, that was a big thing that Microsoft has changed, is they've re-implemented the designer. I think they're explaining the fact that Visual Studio itself is a .NET Framework application, and because the controls are now, not relying on everything that was in .NET Framework, it was a challenge for them. But the rich design time that you're used to in our old WinForms controls, it's not fully there in .NET 5 yet. So what you can do, which I'll show all this in a second, you can drag and drop the controls from the toolbox to the designer surface. You can resize them. You can still work with like the little smart tag menu, and you can set properties through the property grid. The main thing that's missing is any of that rich hovering functionality you would get over the controls. And I'll show you how you can work around that in a control like Flex Grid or Ribbon in my demo next. Any other questions?
Yep, there's one more, and that is, how long will you support .NET 4.5.2?
Yeah, so typically we always support the latest version of .NET and the previous one. And by support, I really mean like shipping with new features, new controls. You'll start to notice that the new innovations start to happen more often for the newer of the two versions. So for this case, like in a year from now, you'll probably be seeing more stuff for .NET 5, and the .NET 4 stuff will become more stable. But really how long we support it will depend upon the usage. So for example, if the industry does not adopt .NET 5 we would support .NET 4 forever, or indefinitely at least. But I will say regarding .NET 5, once .NET 6 comes out, I do see us shifting .NET 5 directly into .NET 6. So long-term support for .NET 5 probably will not be there, but the migration from .NET 5 to 6 will be basically instantaneous. There's not going to be any work. Essentially, it'd be like upgrading from like .NET Core 3 to 3.1 or something like that. Very easy to update. But the .NET 4.52 will stay on its own branch for a long time to come. I can't say exactly how many more years, considering that we still ship the 2.0 controls and the 4 controls have even more users today. I would expect it for a long time to come. Any other questions?
No, that's all for now.
Okay. So let me jump over here to Visual Studio. And let me walk through creating a new .NET 5 application pretty quickly here. So if you're creating a new .NET 5 application in Visual Studio, you're going to want to look for the Windows Forms or WPF app template, and you're going to want to choose the one that says .NET. So Microsoft has now separated the naming here between .NET Framework and .NET. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new .NET application and just give it a default name here. One thing I expect Microsoft to do in the future is add another drop down to this screen that lets you choose the .NET version, because right now, currently, whenever you create the application, it defaults to .NET Core 3.1 still. So once this is set up here, I'm going to first jump into the properties of my application and change the target framework to be .NET 5. This is an important step here, but especially before you go adding any of the controls, because our ComponentOne .NET 5 controls will not work in .NET Core 3.1. As I mentioned before, if you're doing .NET Core 3.1, you're going to want to stick with the .NET 4.5.2 controls. Okay, so I've set the version to .NET 5. The next thing I'm going to want to do is open up the Nuget Package Manager and add the ComponentOne packages from Nuget. So here I'm going to search for, I'm going to add the new ComponentOne ribbon. So I'm going to type c1.win.ribbon to quickly find that. And when you're looking for the ComponentOne controls in Nuget, make sure you're looking for the 5 version if you're working with .NET 5. Going to install that. And of course, this brings in any of the dependencies. I'm also going to go ahead and add FlexGrid once this lets me. As I mentioned, some of the namespaces changed. One of the big namespace changes here is with our FlexGrid control. It's no longer C1 FlexGrid, it's just win.flexgrid. So I'm going to go ahead and install that as well. Now, normally, if you're used to working with our controls in the past, you would see them installed in the toolbox. Now, we will continue to support toolbox installation. Of course, right now with them on Nuget.org, they're not going to appear in your toolbox by default. You have to first add the references, as I'm doing right now, which adds the dependency packages to FlexGrid and Ribbon. Then when you go to your design surface, you'll see them appear in the toolbox. So C1 WinForms controls, it now just lists all the controls that are referenced in your application. But in the future, when you install our product, you will see them being added in the toolbox over here. Because we also ship the Nuget packages locally, so you don't have to use Nuget.org in your company if that's not what you prefer. If you prefer to host everything locally, you can do that. So I'm going to go ahead and just drag and drop the control onto the designer surface. So we have a ribbon, and I'll drag the FlexGrid over here. As I mentioned, the design time support is a bit limited, but you still have the smart tag functionality here. So I can go ahead and dock FlexGrid in the container here. I can do all of this functionality from the smart tag. And on the ribbon, you can load a template, perhaps from a previous application, but you'll notice that all of the rich design time functionality is missing from a control like ribbon. In the past, you could just click on here, add a button, add a button, add a button, add a tab. For now, temporarily, you have to do all of this through the property grid editor. So the ribbon is consisted of a collection of tabs, which has a collection of groups, which has a collection of items. So I'm just going to open up the property grid editor for the tabs. There's already a tab added, default tab. I could add more tabs here. On this select the tab, I'm going to go up to groups for all the groups, open up that editor. There's one group added by default already. So in this group, I will go ahead and add a button by finding, I think it's the items collection. So then from this property editor, I can now add in my buttons and build my ribbon this way and sort and set all the properties this way, so on and so forth. So now let's just go ahead and run this just to prove that it works. And of course, everything else regarding the data binding, the API and C# VB code behind, all the same. Nothing's changing there. It's really, when it comes to .NET 5, we're really looking at surface level. We have designer stuff, we have publication stuff, which is also different. So aside from the better performance that you'll get out of the box, one of the other key features of .NET 5 is this single file application. So let me just show you how you can do that real quick. I have this other application here, this Flex Pivot Explorer, which is a WPF sample. So this Flex Pivot Explorer shows the new Flex Pivot for WPF control. See, I'm going to run this first. So our Flex Pivot essentially delivers runtime pivot table building similar to Microsoft Excel or Power BI, or like similar to Tableau, where users can build these ad hoc views at runtime. So to publish this application, what I'm going to do is simply right-click on the project and go to Publish. And then if you're doing this for the first time, you have to build a little profile here, and it sort of walks you through in the wizard so you can choose how you're going to publish the application. So I'm going to just publish it to a folder. Here you could choose click once and then make all the click once settings, but I'm going to choose the simpler option for now, which is just publish it to a folder. And then click finish. This just sort of creates my profile. Now come in here to the configuration settings, and in here you'll find the option to publish to a single file application. For some reason, they don't show it by default. You have to first choose self-contained, and then you can choose single file. I don't know what the reason for that is, because you can actually switch this back to framework dependent and keep the single file. But anyway, I'll first publish this as self-contained. Self-contained means the application will publish the .NET runtime along with the app. But the trick here, or maybe the little bit of a lie here, is that it actually does not produce a single file. I will show you this next. So I'm going to publish this as a self-contained single file, quote unquote, application. Let's see what happens. It's publishing. And it was published to a folder, so I had to open up the folder for my project here. File Explorer, goes under bin, release, .NET 5, publish. So here, this is what was output by a self-contained application. So as a single file. Most of my application is here in this single file that's 127 megabytes. However, all of these other files need to be distributed with the application. And this is essentially all of the .NET runtime necessary information. If you truly want to create a single file publication, you want to choose framework dependent. But now the one caveat here is that it requires the user has .NET Framework installed on their machine, which, if you're working in a controlled environment, in a company or an enterprise, most people you can ensure that most people are running Windows and they can have .NET. So let's go ahead and publish this. It's framework dependent. And this should truly publish the application as a single exe file, including all of the ComponentOne controls bundled up in there as well. And it did. There's one extra little file here thrown out, the PDB. That's just for like debugging information. But my publish now is one executable. It's now only 7 megabytes. And now when I run this, I get my full application, including the ComponentOne controls, with licensing, everything. Next, let's just take a look at some of the other top ComponentOne controls available for .NET 5 today. So I'm going to run here. This is the new .NET, or the new Demo Explorer, from which I can just launch the Control Explorer without having to build anything in Visual Studio. So you're going to want to download this. If you're running the old one, it may or may not show the .NET 5. We pretty much refreshed the UI here. If you have the old UI, it may actually still show the .NET 5. I think the list of demos was controlled separately. But I'm going to go ahead here under WinForms, look for the Control Explorer .NET 5. I've already downloaded it. I'm going to launch it. and show some of the controls here. Of course, we have FlexGrid, which I showed earlier without any data in it. So FlexGrid is our most popular data grid control for WinForms, WPF, Xamarin, UWP, JavaScript, Blazor, every platform. The .NET 5 version is 100% compatible with .NET 4.5.2. We haven't changed anything except that namespace, which I mentioned. Except, of course, now with .NET 5, you can take advantage of better performance, all for free. So it supports grouping, conditional formatting, etc. One of the more noticeable features with .NET 5 is our support for high DPI anywhere in the controls that use icons. So the feature of high DPI was actually introduced with .NET 4.7, I believe. But as you now know, our controls, the previous version of our controls was .NET 4.5, so we weren't able to use .NET 4.7 features until now with .NET 5, which is real exciting. So I know we've had people complaining about issues using our controls in high DPI, so now these issues are finally able to be resolved very easily with .NET 5. So high DPI icons. Our new ribbon control also supports the simplified collapsed view. We also have the beautiful Flex Viewer, which again also uses the ribbon. We have the Rules Manager, which lets you build ad hoc conditional formatting for your UI on the fly. The user can manage the rules. Now for WPF, we have a lot of the same controls. For WPF, we have the FlexGrid control here. Now, what's nice about the FlexGrid for WPF is we've changed the default style of our WPF controls to be more fluent, a bit more minimalistic looking. You'll also see that a lot of the same features, conditional formatting. There's also some built-in animation features. So when you change the columns, reorder the columns, of course, grouping is there as well with animation. We also have our WPF charts ready for .NET 5. The chart comes ready with trend lines and line markers, multiple plot areas, legends, animation, axis grouping, and so on. Plus we have the financial chart, which has all of our advanced finance chart types, rich text box, docking, tab, and our new ribbon that I briefly mentioned before. It's a lot cleaner than our previous one. It has the Office 365 style, as well as the simplified view as well. Now this control is a new namespace, C1 ribbon, but it's the same API as our previous C1 toolbar control. So we have the C1 toolbar tool strip as well in there. All right, next let's demonstrate how we can migrate an application to .NET 5. So let me run back here to my slides. Oh, one last thing I want to mention. So I mentioned that to get the .NET 5 controls today, you're going to need to get them from Nuget.org. But with our 2020 v3 release coming soon, they will be installed with the official C1 control panel, as you see here. So you'll be able to install the .NET 5 controls separately from 4.52. So next, let's demonstrate how you can migrate a WinForms app to .NET 5, specifically one that's referencing ComponentOne controls. So there's a lot of information out there already on migrating apps, tips and tricks. But really the most important thing to first start with are questions that you should ask yourself, like, why do you want to migrate to .NET 5? Or should you migrate to .NET Core 3.1 first and then 5? Always keep in mind that WinForms is a Windows-only framework, so even though .NET Core can run on Linux and Mac, Windows UI cannot. So the reason you would want to migrate is to take advantage of those features we discussed, like single runtime executables, better performance, high DPI, and so on. And one of the neat features is, of course, that ability to package the entire .NET platform with your app. So that means you can also run WinForms or WPF on any Windows machine that doesn't have .NET installed. So those features that I mentioned are the reason why you would want to migrate. But also keep in mind that the .NET framework is not going anywhere. Microsoft has made that clear. So you don't need to migrate. But if you want to innovate and be more scalable across platforms, future-proof, then you may decide to port parts of your application. Of course, once you have a .NET 5 application, it would be easier, in theory, to then move that to, say, Blazor, make it a web app. In general, it's about the same effort to migrate .NET 5 or to migrate to .NET 5 versus .NET Core. So you don't need to migrate to .NET Core first. You can go directly from .NET Framework to .NET 5. But of course, before migrating, make sure you have the latest version of Visual Studio 16.8. There are some helpful tools as well, which I have listed here. There's the .NET Portability Analyzer. This you can use to determine if your project will migrate to .NET Core and .NET 5. If your project has potential issues, such as referencing unsupported libraries, this analyzer helps you identify those problems. There's also the Windows Compatibility Pack. This is not really a tool, but rather, I guess, a set of APIs that are missing from .NET 5. These were part of .NET Framework, but removed. So now they're available as a separate pack that you can add. And I guess they're rewritten in a .NET 5 friendly way that doesn't break your application. It's still truly .NET 5. Lastly, Microsoft shared last week at .NET Conf this try convert tool. So this was a tool provided by their .NET team as another way to help convert project files automatically. So it handles a lot of the tedious work, but I'm about to show you what it is, the tedious work that you'd have to do. It's really not that difficult. It's just a little tedious. So let me walk you through these steps. I just have this all in PowerPoint, so it'll be very quick. The steps to migrate to .NET 5. So here I have a WinForms application that's using FlexGrid. You'll notice it's referencing some DLLs, specifically C1 Win.dll, C1 FlexGrid. And if your app contains multiple projects and dependencies, you'll want to start from the bottom up. So start with projects that don't depend on others. And if you have any non-UI libraries, or code that can run anywhere, those will be migrated to .NET Standard or .NET Core library first. So the first step is to create a new folder inside the main solution folder of your .NET Framework project. So this new folder will contain the new .NET 5 project, basically to avoid conflicts with the bin and the OBJ folders, but it also serves as a backup. The next step is to manually create the new .NET 5 project file. So in this file, all we have to do is set the target framework and the assembly name to be different. You could create this file in Notepad and just name it csproj, or you could create it in Visual Studio, whatever you're more comfortable with. Oh, and also note regarding this whole migration, we have this published as a blog. So if you'd rather copy and paste from there, I'll share the blog link afterwards. Step 3 is to copy the compiled and resource files from your old project to the new. So compiled files are essentially all of your code files. You could literally just copy them from one project to the other, or you could just modify the file references within the project file, as I have shown here on the right. It really depends on what you want to do. If you want to continue multiple build outputs, like a build output for .NET Framework, one for .NET 5, then it makes sense to just reference the files so you only have to edit them in one place. If you're planning to just dump the framework version, then you may as well just copy all the files over. Now, regarding the ComponentOne files, there's one that you will no longer need in .NET 5, and that is the licenses.licx. So the licensing code is one of those poor .NET Framework APIs that Microsoft did not carry forward with .NET Core and .NET 5. So you may have heard or noticed with the ComponentOne 2020 V2 release, we enrolled new licensing. And with this new licensing, all of our .NET 5 controls must use the new licensing. Our existing .NET 4 controls and so on have backward compatibility to the old licensing. So if you're still using those, you probably didn't notice any change. But basically, the new licensing is handled at build time in the Nuget package build scripts. The next step is to add the .NET 5 project to your solution or into a new solution. So you could do this through Visual Studio, through the Add Existing Project menu, or by command, and then you're going to choose that file, that csproj file that we created and modified. Step 5 is we're now ready to add all of our libraries. So for example, if we're focused on ComponentOne here, we're going to add these controls. Since .NET 5 uses Nuget Packages, you'll need to add them in this way. Now you don't have to get them from Nuget.org. You can always build a local Nuget repository. So if your company wants to manage the packages, have complete control over them so one developer doesn't accidentally go grab a new version unintentionally, you can do that. And we do ship the Nuget packages with the download. And for WinForms and WPF, you'll want to pay attention to the names of the packages you install. While we hate to break things, we did take this opportunity to sort of clean up and make the naming consistent. So for example, you may see C1 dropped from the .NET 5 package name compared to .NET 4.5.2. And lastly, depending on if the namespace of the package that you're using changed, you'll have to do a mass find and replace in your code to update the namespaces. And that's basically it. Of course, the more complex your application is, the more steps it will take to copy all these things. But converting the project is basically just changing the target framework and converting the library references to Nuget packages. Another thing you'll notice is that .NET 5 and .NET Core, they don't use the packages.config file. All of the Nuget packages are handled as package references in the project file. So the full details for this migration, we also have published as a blog, so you can copy and paste stuff from there. It's a lot easier. Alec actually wrote this, and he actually also included a sample, the same one that I just showed you from screenshots. You can also just browse that from the Grape City blogs page. The last thing I want to share with you is our roadmap. So we've been collecting feedback from users, not only from our surveys and forums, but also from our installer that users can opt in to provide feedback. So from all that data, we've prioritized what controls we migrated first. The goal is to migrate all or most of the controls by the end of 2021. There are, however, a few exceptions. So over the past few years, we've rolled out some new charts and reports with Flex Chart and Flex Report. These controls are feature compatible with their predecessors, such as C1 Chart and C1 Report. So we do not plan to bring these legacy versions to .NET 5. Additionally, C1 TrueDB Grid is one that's always held the second data grid spot behind FlexGrid for WinForms. We would like to focus on a single data grid for .NET 5 in the future moving forward. So if you're a user out there using C1 TrueDB Grid, we would love to hear your feedback about it and know pain points as to why, what you love about that grid and what you wish could be enhanced in FlexGrid. At a high level feature point, the features are compatible. It's just that the FlexGrid's a different control. Things are handled a bit differently. So we understand that there's going to be some pain points. We would love to know what those things are. We do plan to publish more resources on migrating from TrueDB Grid to FlexGrid in the near future. All of this roadmap details also listed in my .NET 5 blog, so you don't have to memorize all these controls that we plan to release out. You can find it at this link right here, this .NET 5 release blog, or you could just browse the latest ComponentOne blogs at grapecity.com and you'll easily find it. If you have any more questions today, we can answer them now. Or if you want to provide feedback later, please, we have this email set up called c1-product/team.us@grapecity.com. We look forward to hearing any feedback you have for us there. But I'll stop and ask Alec one more time if we have any questions.
Yes, so we have two at the moment. This first one is, since some controls are missing in .NET 5 that we use in 4.5.2, are we able to mix controls from .NET 5 and 4.5.2 in the same application?
No, I don't think you'll be able to do that. So that is definitely an important piece of information to understand, that you may not be able to migrate until later in 2021, depending on how we get these controls out. It is taking us, a good amount of time to refactor and make sure that these controls are fully ready for .NET 5. We didn't want to just do like a quick port of all of them. It's possible that they could work. It really depends on the shared libraries. So for example, there's that C1.win library that a lot of the packages use. I think that's going to prevent you from being able to mix and match.
All right. The other one is we have a .NET 4 app, and we're not sure if we should convert it to .NET 5 or not.
Okay, so yeah, basically as I covered, the main thing you're going to want to ask yourself is, why would you want to migrate? So it's basically all about taking advantage of the underlying benefits that Microsoft builds into each new version. So it's sort of like, I'm sure maybe if you started the application in .NET 2 or .NET 3 and then you migrate to .NET 4, the same reason as to why you migrated in that first place is the same type of reason that's going to exist today. .NET 5 just has more benefits, things like that. And even though .NET 5 may sound like a bigger change or a huge departure from the standard track, we believe that it can be looked at as the next version of .NET Framework, not just in branding. So depending on how complex your app is, there may be some Microsoft libraries that are no longer supported in .NET 5, but if the functionality is feasible, then there should be a solution. So maybe the library changed or the API changed. But third-party libraries are popping up to fill in those gaps, like the Windows compatibility pack, even. Any other questions?
Yes, we have one more that just came in. Are the dock controls available in .NET 5, and are they changed at all?
Yeah, so I'm going to assume he's talking about the C1 docking tab in WinForms. Those are available in .NET 5 in the command library, and they're not changed. And we also have, if he's talking about WPF, there's also the dock control in WPF, which is also available and unchanged. Yeah, when I mentioned earlier about the C1 command library being partially unsupported, if you read my blog, I have a longer list of the controls that we're not moving to .NET 5, and that does include C1 out bar, C1 topic bar. Those are controls that were based on, I think the C1 out bar was based on like Windows 2003 or something, and C1 topic bar was based on something from Windows XP. They're just old, outdated controls that we're not going to move forward with. So that's why the command library is considered partially supported.
Okay, we've got another last minute one jumping in here, asking if the webinar will be available somewhere to rewatch when this is over.
Yes, so we are recording this, so we will be putting it live, or not live, we'll be putting the video on our ComponentOne video page, maybe as soon as today.
That is all the questions for now, unless any more questions jump in at the end here.
Okay. If we have no more questions, I'd like to thank everyone for attending this webinar. And if you think of a question later, if you didn't get it in time, you can always email us at the email that's on the screen here. But for now, goodbye, everybody, and have a nice day.